In this lesson, we're going to start learning the 5-step editing recipe that I believe every photographer should know, and we're finally going to start visually changing some images. All right? I'm going to focus primarily on landscape in this specific lesson. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to the Develop module. I like to press the letter D, as in David, to do the shortcut to get over there. And I'm going to press Shift F 2 times to get myself a little bit more real estate. And by the way, this bottom bar right here, I can press T and get rid of it, or T and bring it back. I'll get rid of it for a second. And then over here on the left, you have things like presets, history, etc., and a preview navigator up here. So if you're zoomed in, you can kind of see what part of the image you are. It kind of represents it right over here, like it shows you're only in this little square area. And you can collapse any of these, expand any of them. Same thing over here. Okay, so a couple things. We are going to be working primarily in the basic module, which is represented right here. So you go to develop and then basic. Okay, you see how there's a bunch of things here: tone curve, HSL, color grading, detail, etc. We're not really going to focus so much on these extra things in this course. Okay, I'll save that for a later lesson on more advanced stuff, because honestly, all you need to know is right here in this basic panel. And in fact, don't think of it as basic, think of it as amazing. Think of it as basically incredible. Okay? So first of all, I'm going to run through what these things are in the basic panel. So if you can click here and it opens it. You can click this little arrow. Either way, expands it. All right. Double click and I'll set that back to 0. By the way, if any of this stuff has changed, okay, you can click the reset button. If I go like this, you can click the reset button and it goes back to 0. Okay, the only thing that doesn't go back to 0 is the temperature and the tint. Sometimes tint will start at 0, but temperature usually never does. It's usually somewhere around 5,000-ish. So if you double click, it'll go back to wherever it was starting, like the starting place, the way it was shot. Okay, but the other ones, if the exposure is up here, you can double click and it resets it. By the way, the other thing you can do is, here's a shortcut key for you. If you have made a change, you push Command Z on a Mac and it will undo that change. Okay. If you're on a PC, it's Control Z. Okay. It's a very great key to have in your back pocket. Shortcut key, because it's one of those ones you will use a lot. So I'm going to run through what these things do really quick in the basic module, and then we're going to walk you through the 5 steps, because I don't do them in order. I actually do them a little bit out of order, and I'll kind of explain why. So first of all, the first thing is temperature, and the combination of temperature right here and tint, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. The combination of temperature and tint is what makes up the color balance, okay, the white balance, all right? If I slide to the left and go a lower number, okay, it's going to make the picture more blue, okay? If I slide to the right, let's see, this is where we started. If I slide to the right, it's going to make it more yellow, more orangish, okay? It's warmer. See how this is a warmer temperature and this is a cooler temperature. So blue is cool, warm is yellow. I'll double click and I'll set it back to 0. Okay, tint, you can see green over on this side, red on this side. As an example, to the right adds plus, it's very red. Okay, I'll double click, we'll undo, go to the left, green, makes it more green. Okay, so the combination of these two, warm, red, or warm and green, or blue and green, or blue and red, right? The combination of those two makes up the white balance, okay? And a lot of times it's hard to tell what the white balance should be at first, so that's why I don't set it starting out. Let's move on. The next section, it's called tone, and the first thing is exposure. Exposure is essentially the brightness of the image, okay? If you lower the exposure, you can see how it's negative over here, right? Negative 290, okay? If you lower it, it's gonna get darker. I'll push Command Z, I'll undo that. If I add, it's going to get brighter. Look, I'm at +5. You can see that over here. +5, super bright. So if I lower it, it gets darker, even almost unrecognizably so. And if I raise it, it's going to get brighter. Okay. Now contrast is basically makes whites whiter and blacks blacker the more contrast you add. Okay. So if I add contrast, notice how it made these shadows even darker and maybe these whites more prevalent. Okay. It's kind of gray in this area right here. And if I add contrast, this is extreme, of course, it's adding lots of contrast. It's making the shadows completely black, and it's making those whites even closer to white, okay? If you lower the contrast, it's gonna make this whole area go more gray, so less contrast. See how it's kind of like lower, a little bit more blah? That's essentially what it does. You know, in the negative, it goes more towards gray, and in the positive, it's going towards black and white, or higher contrast, okay? I'm gonna zoom out, and we'll look at that again. Okay, this is 100% contrast. Now, granted, we're not probably going to do 100% contrast, okay? Like, we probably wouldn't do that. We might do, 10, 20%, something like that. But just so you can kind of get a perspective on what it's doing, okay? Now, highlights are pretty cool. Highlights, if you move them to the left, to negative, it's going to bring back the details in the highlights, in the bright parts of the image. This is a really cool, really beneficial tool to have in your tool belt. If you raise the highlights, it's going to make everything that's bright go whiter. It's going to increase the highlights. So typically I don't increase the highlights. A lot of times what I'm doing is I'm actually decreasing the highlights. That's what I typically do. Now shadows, it's kind of the opposite, right? To the negative, it's making the darker areas darker. And if I go to a positive direction over here, it's making the darker areas or the shadows brighter. Okay, it's filling in the details underneath. Okay, now the whites, kind of self-explanatory. Do you want to make the whites darker, or do you want to make the whites brighter? Obviously, plus is always brighter. That's the way, like, that's the rule here, okay? Now, the blacks are the black areas, okay? And the highlights and the whites tend to kind of overlap a little teeny bit, but you can kind of see the edits behaving a little bit differently depending on what you do. Like, if I bring the whites all the way down, it does that. If I bring the highlights all the way down, it does that. So they don't do the exact same thing. You kind of got to massage, tweak a little bit, and see what really makes the most sense. But blacks, if I lower the blacks, it's making all of the blacks even blacker. If I raise them, it's making them brighter, okay? It does a similar thing to what the shadows do, but again, shadows and highlights are a bit more dramatic, and the blacks and the whites are a little bit more subtle. Now the presence area right here, okay, is the combination of texture, clarity, and dehaze. And there's a little subdivider right here for vibrance and saturation. I guess they're all kind of grouped together, but I think of them as a little bit different. Now texture can add texture to an image. Okay, you see more details in the water and stuff like right here. I'm gonna zoom out, okay, and it's gonna lower texture as you go negative, okay? So here's where our starting place was. Here's adding texture. Here's reducing texture. Okay. As a general rule for landscapes, I usually add a little texture, and for portraits, I usually remove a little texture so that we don't see as much blemishes, on the face and stuff like that. Okay. Now clarity is, it behaves kind of similar. As I add clarity, it's kind of clarifying the image, and of course, plus 100 in a lot of situations is going to make it look super cheesy. If I remove clarity by going in a negative way, it's going to make everything a little bit less clear. It's removing clarity, so it's making it less clear. Now, dehaze behaves in a similar way. You're going to kind of have to just play around and see what these things do, right? But dehaze is kind of like contrast a little bit, except for it's a bit more dramatic than contrast is. If you go contrast all the way, it's definitely a big effect, but dehaze all the way is even more dramatic, okay? So contrast and dehaze are very similar. They just kind of behave, the drama of them are a little bit different, okay? If you lower the dehaze, it's gonna make everything kind of hazy, okay? So negative makes it hazy, positive makes it, less hazy. Now vibrance is kind of the intensity or the vibrance of the color. Okay, if I go to 100%, by the way, I'm just doing hundreds as examples here. Okay, so you can see these things kind of in a vacuum. Okay, what are these filters? What do these adjustments do if you're doing them one at a time? Well, it's adding the vibrance and intensity to the colors. Okay, one important thing to note is if you remove the vibrance all the way down, it does actually look like it is almost black and white, but it's not quite. There's still some blue left in here, so it doesn't completely desaturate or make it a black and white. However, saturation, if you remove it all the way to negative 100, it 100% does make the image black and white, okay? But there's an easier way to go to black and white. You could just click this and it makes it black and white up there, okay? So that's probably what I would do if I wanted to go black and white. I'll switch back to color here, black and white, color, okay? But saturation is the thing I try not to mess with too much. If I do, it's only adding 5% or so, because it gets real cheesy real fast. Like look at the craziness of it. So typically what I'll do is I'll add a little vibrance and maybe a smidge of saturation, but not too much or it gets cheesy. Okay. So I'm going to click the reset button and I'm going to reset this all the way back to 0. Okay. Now in the next lesson, I'm going to show you the exact order that I use for the 5-step editing recipe, starting with landscapes.